most of you would be familiar with the forthcoming geopolitical tussle between the Tibetan diaspora and the People's Republic of China over the selection and identification over the future 15th Dalai Lama. More recently, the selection and identification of the 10th Khalkha Jetsun Lampa Rinpoche of Mongolia by His Holiness created quite some disquiet in the People's Republic of China, showing that Tibetan Buddhist reincarnates are inextricably intertwined with perceptions of state sovereignty in this particular region. However, are they vital to India's security? These questions might seem esoteric, and joining us today to help us unravel some of the mysteries behind this concept is Tibetologist par excellence, Mr. Claude Arpi, who is also a distinguished fellow at the Center of Excellence for Himalayan Studies at the Shiv Nadar Institution of Eminence at New Delhi. Mr. Arpi, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, sir, to start off the bat, let's just clear up the semantics. We hear the words Tibetan reincarnate, or even words like Tulku or Rinpoche used interchangeably. What exactly is meant by a Tibetan reincarnate in this context?
Okay, then I would like to say to start with that I'm not expert in religious matter. I'm more looking after geopolitics. But for the last 50 years, I came first in India in 72, so 51 years, I have been following, I have met many of these Tulkus and Rinpoches. So I will say in a very simple way, something which is very complicated, and I hope that I'm correct in my religious interpretation of it. Now, Tulku is we could say an instrument. You know, the Buddhas, they live in another world. The tradition, Tibetan tradition, say they live in an enjoyment world, in enjoyment bodies in Sambhogakaya. Now they have to connect somehow with the people on earth and people, all sentient beings, human beings, animals, and all. So they need to have a sort of emanation body, which is Nirmanakaya, which is the Tulku. The real meaning of a Tulku is an emanation body. Now, Tulku can be an emanation of the highest Buddha, which is very rare, and that we don't, very often we don't even know that they are on earth. But it can be also the incarnation, the emanation of a bodhisattva. We have the case of the Dalai Lama, who is an emanation of Avalokiteshvara Chenrezig for the Tibetan, which is the bodhisattva of compassion, or the Panchen Lama, who is the second in the hierarchy, but who is in Tibet presently, or in China. Nobody knows where he exactly is. He is the incarnation of Amitayus. So, and there is another category. You can be also the emanation or the reincarnation, the representing the consciousness of a previous master. You know, in Tibet there was up to 4,000 recognized Tulku. So there was even a register in a potala where the name of the Tulku were entered once they had been approved. So some are very high masters, realized master. Some are representing some smaller monastery or some yogis who come again in this life. The purpose is, the religious purpose is to pass on the tantric lineage. So like in Hinduism or in Tantrism, you have a lineage. The Tibetan Tantrayana has a lineage. So the easiest, safest way to transmit this lineage is via the reincarnation, if that person is found and if that person is correct. Unfortunately, there was a lot of I should say mistakes, or sometimes you don't find the correct incarnation because it's not a very scientific process. And if I can say a few words about historical background, the first reincarnation is the second Karmapa. When the first Karmapa passed away at the beginning of the 13th century, Karma Bakshi was recognized as reincarnation. So it started the process, the lineage of reincarnation. And many of the other schools, including the Sakyapa, the Nyingmapa, and the Gelugpa, the yellow school of the Dalai Lama, use this concept to pass on the lineage. And of course, and I think we'll come to it later, it took also a political connotation and a more material connotation. So that is the basis of the... So Tibet is very special in the sense that it's systematically, since the 13th century, and for the Dalai Lama's lineage since the 16th, 17th century, they have recognized the reincarnation, and this reincarnation had also a political role very often.
Correct. And as you were beginning to allude to, for some Tibetan Buddhist reincarnates, the role was not strictly religious, but there historically were also cases of them having temporal power. And even in contemporary times, His Holiness the Dalai Lama being perhaps the best example. But more recently, we have seen that this was not strictly limited just to Tibet. And we see, for example, the Jetsun Dampas of Mongolia, for instance, the 10th of which was just identified and apparently did cause disquiet in Beijing. It is quite evident that Tibetan reincarnates or tulkus do pose a challenge to Chinese perceptions of sovereignty. How precisely does that happen? Why would China be wary of reincarnates or tulkus?
I want to say first that China is a communist country. A communist regime normally do not believe in such a thing than reincarnation. But it has taken so large political implication that they have jumped into the reincarnation business, and now they are becoming masters in defining how a reincarnation should be found. And it came first in 1995 when, after the previous Panchen Lama, the 10th Panchen Lama, had passed away in 1989, Dalai Lama had discovered the reincarnation, and Mr. Jiang Zemin, who was the president at that time, got so furious that he said, no, we have to find our own, and they started a process of using a golden urn, and they found their own Panchen Lama, Gyatsen Nobu, which is used extensively by the regime, communist regime these days, and which will be probably used to recognize the Chinese Panchen Lama, Dalai Lama, sorry. So, and at the same time, the Dalai Lama, the boy that was recognized by the Dalai Lama, is still somewhere in jail in China for more than 25 years. Now, it has always had a political connotation. For example, the Sakya sect in the 13th, 14th century, which was very close to the Mongol Khans, had the patronage of the Khan. They ruled Tibet. So they were sharing that temporal power and at the same time the religious power. Similarly, during the Ming Dynasty, the Karmapa had a lot of influence on the Chinese emperor. And of course, after the great fifth Dalai Lama in 17th century, the yellow sect, the Gelugpa, took over the temporal power in Tibet, and all the Dalai Lama from the 5th, 6th till the 14th had been that dual power, temporal and religious. It's only in 2011 that the Dalai Lama decided to make the Tibet democracy and ask for an elected leader to rule the day-to-day affairs of the government in exile. So that was sort of a revolution. And I have to say that there are many tulkus, Dalai Lama in Tibet. And the most prominent one is the Dorje Pamo, who was one of the very few female tulku, and who was at the same rank than the Panchen Lama, slightly maybe lower, but very, very prominent reincarnation, and who is today in Tibet. There are many others, including the Taksang Repa, who is the head Lama of Ladakh, of Emis, who went for studying in Tibet, and the Chinese never let him come back. I think he came back once to Ladakh for a visit, and after return, now there is no question. So Chinese is holding this and usually give them a political post. So already you see the politics is fully into the process. But it's not only the politics, because it's also the wealth of the lamas and the number of disciples these Lama were having. So there is something called the Labrang in Tibetan, which is the estate of a Lama. It can be like in the case of Panchen Lama, it's an entire province, Tsang province, the southern province of central Tibet, or it can be a few hundred of acres around the monastery. But usually the monastery have a lot of wealth. So this is also linked with reincarnation. And in the process of reincarnation, you have a gap of 20 years. So I don't know if it's a good thing or not for the religious purpose, but for the temporal purpose, including managing the Labrang, managing the estates, it makes a gap of 20 years, during which the estate manager called the Changze. Some were famous, some were infamous in Tibet. Some of these Changze were trying to get more wealth and to add activity which were not at all connected with the Dharma. So that was, I think, one of the problems in all Tibet. And of course, when this Lama came in exile in 5960, all this wealth was left in Tibet, but many of them have reconstituted some of the big monasteries. And the Changze played a role in the history of Tibet, which is sometimes had not helped Tibet. And above the Changze, in the case of the Dalai Lama or the Panchen Lama, there were regents. And these regents sometimes were not up to the mark. In 1947, there was nearly a civil war in Tibet between the two regents, Reting Rinpoche and Takpa Rinpoche. And that really created, I think, a very bad situation for the Tibetan state. And 3 years later, the Chinese came in, but it weakened tremendously. So this connection with wealth, with estates, with political power has been not a very good thing in the history of Tibet, according to me. And one more thing, if you allow me, the fact that that it takes 20 years for a Lama to reach majority, whether it's a Dalai Lama or any Lama, sometimes has created a political void. If you take the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 Panchen Lama, Dalai Lama, sorry, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 Dalai Lama, they all died before reaching majority. It means during the 19th century, there was 5 Dalai Lama, and none of them were able to rule. The entire country was ruled by the regents and by the Chinese Hamban, the envoy of the emperor, who used these periods to impose certain things on the Tibetan state. And one of the reasons why Tibet today is not free is that the weakening of the state in the 19th century due to that gap. So I think still today it's a huge problem if we think in terms of the 15th Dalai Lama, that gap.
Correct. And you have also written about and also discussed that China now is actively preparing for what you call a post 14th Dalai Lama period, particularly through, I guess, the reincarnates that are within their territorial control. Do you see preparations in India being made to counter some of these developments? Do you see sort of a recognition of the fact that this is going to be a geopolitical issue? For instance, you had the global Buddhist summit in New Delhi just very recently, which in fact did see the attendance of many reincarnates who live in exile and are also not, some of whom are not necessarily Tibetan nationals, but might be from Mongolia or the Mongol republics in the Russian Federation, for instance.
I think China is always thinking ahead. In India, we have a tendency to think after. So they, in 2007 already, they promulgated guidelines how a Lama should reincarnated, how he should be searched, how he should be found, and how he should be enthroned, and very precise guidelines. Of course, as I said, China is a communist country. It's not its business to deal with this thing. India is a secular country. In India's constitution, secularity is the first point. So India should not do the same thing than China. But at the same time, I feel that India can express concern to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and to the Ganden Podang, which is the office of the Dalai Lama, will be responsible to find the 15th Dalai Lama, as well as to the government in exile, that India has stakes, because the entire Himalayan regions, like Ladakh, Laos, Spiti, Kinnaur, Sikkim, Arunachal, pockets in Arunachal, but in Tawang, for example, it's very strong prominence of Tibetan Buddhism. It's the same type of Buddhism. It doesn't mean that the Tawang is part of Tibet or part of China, but Tibetan Buddhism has an influence. So all this population really depend. And you know that China is putting pressure not only in Depsang or Denchok, but also in Yangtze, in Arunachal in December. So that's going to be a live border for the years to come. And whatever happening there is has to be watched. So it has consequences. What will ever will happen to the 14th Dalai Lama and his reincarnation? It has to consequences for the entire Himalayan belt. So in that way, I think India should speak to the Dalai Lama and convey at the highest level India's concern that India has a stake also, but India will respect whatever Dalai Lama decides, but he should maybe decide as soon as possible, not let it go for so many years. And I think one of the most remarkable achievements of this Dalai Lama is to have revived Buddhism in the Himalayan belt. So that connection, Tibetan would call it karmic connection between the Dalai Lama and the Himalayan population is there and very important. So of course, events like the summit is important. India, the Buddha is born, I should not say in India because Nepali will jump on me, but he's born at the border. He's born in Nepal, but at the border. He lives in India, in Bihar. And so this, China cannot take it from India, because if their propaganda machinery progressively is showing that all Buddhism came from China, So that is not acceptable. So events like the Buddhist Summit is very important, and it should be done also on the border areas. Like since 2-3 years, army as well as the local elected leaders in Ladakh have started celebrating July 6th, the Dalai Lama's birthday, on the grand way. And each also send a message on the other side, because the other side, they are not able to celebrate the Dalai Lama's birthday. So you see, China wants to recognize the Dalai Lama. China wants to have the 15th Dalai Lama, but people on the border, on the other side of the McMahon line, or in the other side of Demchok, or other side of Uttarakhand, they are not able to celebrate or have a picture even of the Dalai Lama. If they have built 600 or 700 villages, so-called model villages, but in none of these villages you can see prayer flag. You cannot stay a stupa. You can't say you don't have a monastery. So I think it's important for India to position itself and show that this is a living tradition, Buddhism, and the government is supporting it, of course, while remaining secular. And yes, that's and regarding the Dalai Lama, there's different way of incarnation. One is by direct incarnation, means the traditional way. The Lama dies, a search party is organized. They collect signs where the Lama is born, and later on, the Dalai Lama is eventually recognized and tests are made. But there's another way, is emanation. And I think Dalai Lama, when in 2011, he wrote a very detailed note on this, on the different possibility. He mentioned this emanation. It's something like you have the Shankaracharya, who select his own successor, the junior Shankaracharya, and will groom him and pass on all this lineage, all the initiation, all the empowerment, tantric empowerment, which are required. So that is another, and this would have the advantage to have not such a large gap of 20 years. So that's why I've been writing, in my writing, I've been saying that in modern words, world goes so fast. We are not anymore in 13th century. So we should have something which is more adapted to the times that we are living in.
Mr. Arpi, that was very insightful. On behalf of Global Order, I would like to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.